It's really nice to see everybody. Thank you so much for being here in person. I'm not quite sure where to look for the live stream. I think possibly up here. If you're joining us online, thank you for being with us as well. I'm sorry I can't sort of properly interact with the online audience, but I know that there's quite a lot of you out there, so it's great to have you with us. Thank you very much for coming. So I'm Caroline Levitt. I'm currently the head of the History of Art department here, and I work a lot on text and image relationships. So it's a real pleasure for me this evening to have invited Eric along to speak to you. And I know that we will have a really fascinating talk from him in a moment. I'll just say a little bit about how this fits into the Quartiles Research Forum. So we have a number of research clusters which sort of reflect the current research interests of faculty and other members of staff here. And I run one on word and image. So this event is put on as part of a series of events this term linked to the Word and Image Research Cluster. If you're interested in that, we have another one on the 9th of March. I think I've got that date right. Jean Duffy from Edinburgh is going to come and speak to us about Jean Dubuffet. So you'd be warmly welcome to come along to that too. That will, assuming everything carries on as it is now, that will also be in person and online streamed for those who can't make it to be at Vernon Square. But yeah, real pleasure to see an actual audience and an actual space here this evening. It makes such a difference. And if you're here in person, we'll be able to invite you upstairs to our research forum room for a glass of wine afterwards. So I hope that we'll be able to continue conversations at that point. Eric is going to speak to us this evening about Blaise Cendrars, and I'll just introduce him to you a little bit. He is Professor of Modern French Literature and Visual Cultures at Royal Holloway, University of London. And he's written very widely, actually, on the French and European avant-garde, on bilingual writers, and on text-image relationships. He's the author of several monographs, including Writing Between the Lines. René, I'm going to pronounce this very badly, you're going to have to correct me, Eric. René Chicolet, citoyen français, Deutsche Dichter, art, painter, poet, sculptor, and art, the poetry of forms. Hello, Sarah. He's also co-edited Ivan and Claire Goll, Texts and Contexts, and Robert Dano, Surrealism in the 21st Century, as well as two major volumes on Dada and Beyond. He's also written extensively on modern and contemporary art for museums and galleries in Europe and the USA, and he co-curated the international touring exhibition Art, the Poetry of Forms at the Kröller-Müller Museum and the Turner Contemporary, where I saw it in 2017-18. His paper this evening is connected to the subject of his new book, which is coming out in May this year, I think, is that right? That's right. So do look out for that. It will be called Blaise Cendrars, The Invention of Life. And he's going to speak to us this evening on the textual-visual collaborations of Blaise Cendrars. So without further ado, I will hand over to Eric. Thank you very much. Let's see if we can do something about the lights. Turn down. Oh, you're there. Thank you. Thanks very much. That's great.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for that very generous introduction, and also for very kindly inviting me to give this talk. It's a pleasure to actually be in a room and seeing faces and to be back in this sort of forum. So thank you, and thank you all for coming along. Especially as I suspect that Blaise Cendrars may not be all that central to the work that you do here, although I'm aware of Caroline's wordplay special option, so maybe some of the things that I say will have some relevance to that. So the practice now known as text-image studies is a multi-layered palimpsest with a very long history. Scholars may cite as a starting point Horace's Ars Poetica from 19 BC, with its famous dictum, ut pictura poesis, as in painting, so in poetry. But we can go further back still to Simonides of Chios, who in 500 BC stated that, quote, poetry is a speaking picture painting a silent poetry, an idea that John Dryden revived as the sister arts in the 17th century. That century also saw the recuperation of the Greek term ekphrasis, which denotes a literary description of a visual image. The 18th century German philosopher Gotthold Ephraim Lessing established a neat distinction between literature as an art of time and painting as one of space. Theorists, certainly over the last century or so, have exposed these categories as problematically porous, but have struggled to find an overarching method or label for the multifarious relationships between texts and images. After Warburg and Panofsky's early 20th century studies of iconography and iconology, came along new interdisciplinary approaches, and at the cusp of the digital era, these proliferated emphases differed, but most acknowledged that visual and verbal signs alike are multifarious, context-specific, and unstable. In the 1960s, Dick Higgins coined the term intermedia, and Roland Barthes published his Rhétorique de l'image. A rhetoric of the image is also how W.J.T. Mitchell, in 1986, defined his groundbreaking book, Iconology, Image, Text, Ideology. And some 6 years after that, a group of Belgian semioticians, known collectively as the Groupe Mu, released their Traité du Cine-Visual with the subheading Pour une rhétorique de l'image. Along the way, a whole array of other important figures were adding to our sense of the sheer diversity of semiotic practices that bring together in different ways texts and images. Mika Ball, Linda Nochlin, Drizella Pollock, and others have also revealed the imbrication of institutional and social structures, and not least those pertaining to gender, ethnicity, and social class in the reception of visual and verbal signs. In the early 90s, the term iconotext started to gain currency through works by, amongst others, Alain Montandon, Peter Wagner, to name but two. But that term also has proved slippery and evasive. Liliane Louvel's more recent use of this term, iconotext, proposes a typology of text-image interactions governed by different degrees of pictorial saturation that occur in literary texts. She defines the iconotext as an oxymoron, an impulse to bring together two irreducible objects and to form a new object in a fruitful tension in which each element maintains its specificity. Turning now to Cendrars, the collaborations that I will be discussing, I think, are best thought of as instances of intersemioticity, which is how Francis Héline, a founding member of the Groupe Mu, in his 2020 book, Entre la lettre et l'image, defines those hybrid textual visual entities that are characterized by a certain economy of style, but also by their lack of redundancy. So every element is working hard towards the creation of sense, if you like. So I'm now going to focus on Cendrars. And apologies if some of this is familiar to you, but I couldn't take anything for granted, so I'll give you a little sort of potted biography of him. So the boy who would become the French writer Blaise Cendrars was born Frédéric Louis Sauzère in the Swiss town of La Chaux-de-Fonds in September 1887. His father's ambitious but unsuccessful business ventures meant that the young Sauzère had a peripatetic childhood in Neuchâtel, Naples, Basel, and a boarding school in Germany. Aged 17, he left school definitively and spent the next 3 years working for a jeweler in St. Petersburg. His exposure to different cultures and his resistance to formal education seem to have made him receptive to influences beyond the realm of literature. Other factors would in due course propel him towards the visual arts as a stimulus for his writing. But today I'll be analysing some of the instances of his visual collaborations in order to think a little bit about their impact on his trajectory as a writer. And first of all, I will do a survey of his best known creative collaborations with artists, and then I'd like to examine a little bit more closely two instances where a type of visuality plays an essential role in the conception and realization of the literary work. So, before he settled in France, Cendrars spent the winter of 1911 in New York. Unemployed, penniless, and constantly hungry, he spent his days in the Central Library. In a single febrile night, he drafted a long poem called Les Pâques that would become Les Pâques à New York, Easter in New York. The cover there is from a later edition, 1926 edition, with the image by Franz Maseret. Like Baudelaire's poems of 19th century Paris, this modern-day epic focuses on the city's alienated, marginal figures, poor immigrants from Europe and Asia, as well as drunks, prostitutes, and gangsters, who provide the cast for a meditation on faith in the modern city. This was the poem that launched his career when he arrived in Paris in June 1912. By then, he had adopted a new name, Blaise Cendrars, that symbolized his phoenix-like rebirth from the ashes, cendre, and his poetic ambition, burning like embers, braise. He soon made contact with the international community of artists based in a building known as La Ruche, the Beehive, in the 15th arrondissement. Originally designed by Gustave Eiffel as a pavilion for the 1900 Paris Exposition, the building was converted into studios and became home to many impecunious artists and poets. They included Apollinaire, Archipenko, Brancusi, Chagall, Max Jacob, Léger, Modigliani, Diego Rivera, Soutine, and Zadkine. Modigliani painted Cendrars' portrait, Léger drew it, and in his homage to Apollinaire, Chagall painted Cendrars' name and seems to misspell it. Seems to have forgotten the R in Cendrars, the R just before the final S in Cendrars' name. But looking at this closely, you'll see that there's a whole missing area of Apollinaire's name. So I'd like to suggest that the R in blue there on the top right of that sort of square configuration of names is actually shared by Apollinaire and Cendrars. In turn, Cendrars wrote poems about Archipenko, Chagall, Sonia Delaunay, Léger, and La Ruche itself. Crucially, contact with these avant-garde artists fostered his own poetic experimentation. He later reminisced, "At that time, painters and writers were one and the same. We lived with one another and probably shared the same concerns. You might even say that every writer had his painter. I had Delaunay and Léger, Picasso had Max Jacob, Reverdy had Braque, and Apollinaire had everyone." Through Apollinaire, Cendrars befriended artists Robert and Sonia Delaunay. Sonia's abstract collage binding for Les Pâques was exhibited as an artwork in its own right at the Berlin Herbstsalon, or Autumn Salon, in 1913. That autumn also saw the publication of the Creuse du Transsibérien, Cendrars' epic poem, electrified by Sonia Delaunay's luminous colours. Its theme had an obvious appeal to Delaunay, who had grown up in St. Petersburg. Dubbed the first simultaneous book, as it demanded to be read and viewed, this extraordinary object straddles fine art and applied art and brings everyday forms of discourse into the exalted world of literature. It reflects Cendrars' view that poetry should flow directly from everyday experience, as his 1913 poem Contrast proclaims, "The windows of my poetry are wide open onto the boulevards, and in its shop windows shine the jewels of light." Back to the prose. The radical originality of the prose as an object accounts for its enduring acclaim. It folds and unfolds like a map, and indeed the map of the Trans-Siberian Express route sits alongside the title. Its visual and verbal elements create tension and dissonance rather than harmonious integration. Apollinaire likened it to a musical score that compels the reader to navigate bass and treble clefs. Marjorie Perloff goes further, arguing that the painting undermines the text, compelling the reader to navigate the differences between text and the colours. Its elongated scroll-like form undoubtedly alludes to ancient religious scripture, but also owes something to the Saussure family's visit to the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1900, where they experienced a simulated journey on the Trans-Siberian Express. The exhibit featured the world's longest painting at that time, which was done by Pavel Piasecki on a series of painted scrolls measuring some 600 meters in length and depicting the Trans-Siberian route. Disjuncture characterizes Cendrars' text. It jumps abruptly across locations and time levels, a versatility matched by its typography in different fonts, colours, and margin alignments. The titular Jeanne is a young prostitute, sick and feverish. Her travelling companion, Blaise, soothes her with tales of journeys recent and ancient, real and imagined, triggered by the train's jolting motion. There's something distinctly Proustian about the way that involuntary memory works, and curiously enough, Proust wrote a 14-page letter to Cendrars, having read his first volume of poems. It never reached Cendrars, rather, for reasons that no one's entirely sure about. But it's quite interesting that for all their huge stylistic divergences, Proust and Cendrars somehow they were exploring quite similar ideas. So seen as a whole, the prose invites reflection on the different capacities of word and image to shed their conventional role as vehicles of meaning. By their nature, words are firmly attached to referentiality, to the making of meaning, but in places, Cendrars seems intent on loosening those ties and letting words float towards a more abstract realm. Strings of place names, obscure for most readers of French or English, are reeled off without commentary. Lines like this create a form of sound poetry avant la lettre. Conversely, Sonia Delaunay's overwhelmingly abstract colours take on a figurative, almost narrative dimension at the lower end of the poem. The enlaced Eiffel Tower and Ferris wheel, which could also be a setting sun, constitute a metonymic shorthand for Paris, where the poem comes to a halt with the line Paris, ville de la tour unique, du grand gibet et de la roue. Paris, city of the incomparable tower, the great gibbet and the wheel. If we look at this section, we can see how the structure of the text and the accompanying colours invite a non-sequential reading. Words presented in bold type and large fonts catch the eye first, like posters or newspaper headlines. These include, at the top, the place names that echo the Delaunay's billboard aesthetic and their theories of simultaneous contrast. If you look, I'm not sure how visible it is, but on the far right, they're under the name Delaunay, which Robert Delaunay has rather immodestly placed right in the centre of his painting. You'll see the place names New York, Paris, so it's essentially a sort of shorthand for this international simultaneity that he and Sonia were promoting through their art. Alongside those place names, Cendrars' inventive textual practice conjures up multiple meanings and invites an embodied reading. The repeated place name Patagonie envelops the narrator's suffering, his agonie, that's lexically, it's orthographically contained in the word Patagonie. And when read aloud, that line, which is just underneath the yellow block there, when read aloud, the line also imitates the rhythmic insistence of the train wheels, la Patagonie, la Patagonie. It's got that kind of rhythmic quality. And elsewhere, rhythms are akin to a stutter or a jolt that we feel, I think, as our eye darts from margin to margin, from text to image and back again, as well as in the virtual repetition of some of these lines, but there's usually a difference. Even you can see that in the line Blaise dit sommes-nous bien loin de Montmartre, which becomes dit Blaise. So there's repetition with difference. Cendrars had first published the prose in a German avant-garde journal, Der Sturm, but the European powers' hunger for war had made scope for such international solidarity melt into air. So he promptly enlisted in the French Foreign Legion, and in September 1915, his right arm was blown to pieces and had to be amputated above the elbow. His phantom hand haunted him for the rest of his life, but he avoided addressing the specific circumstances of his wound for some 30 years. When he resumed writing in 1917 and learned to write with his left hand, the impact of the war can be felt even when it's not explicitly mentioned. The short text, Profond d'aujourd'hui, profound today, evokes a world that optical technology has both enhanced and disrupted. The opening line reads, I no longer know if I'm looking at a starry sky with my naked eye or a drop of water through a microscope. Written in a single paragraph that runs over several pages, the text uses the present tense throughout, as if to convey Bergson's theory of time as a perpetual becoming. In terms euphoric and despondent, it expresses flux and ambivalence through syntactic elasticity, shifting narrative voices, and new compound words, prodigious today wave antenna, door face whirlwind, and so on. And the illustrations by Mexican artist Angel Zárraga depict a more pessimistic vision in which the old certainties have vanished, and technology is nothing more than a crutch propping up a damaged and incomplete body. The essay J'ai tué, I have killed, provides a brutally explicit account of the war. It appeared in November 1918, just days before the armistice, with colour lithographs that Cendrars' friend Fernand Léger produced while recovering from a nearly fatal mustard gas attack sustained at the front in 1917. Their shared experience of combat strengthened their affinity. As Christopher Green notes in his timeless book on Léger and the avant-garde, I quote, in 1915 and 1916, in the Argonne and at Verdun, Léger not only saw modern reality in all its mechanized dynamism as never before, but identified with a group of men utterly alien to the avant-garde elite from which he had come in Paris. End quotation. The text adopts a panoramic perspective, and here in the opening page, we have a sense of that, I think, at least textually, there's a panoramic impression. All horizons and 1,000 trains, and so on. Léger seems to reduce the mass of troops to a few rhythmic, repeated, minimal signs. As the text concludes, it zooms in progressively to a graphic close-up that depicts a first-person account of a hand-to-hand fight to the death that shifts into the present tense. Top left there, me voici, here I am, we're there. We witness the really brutal events that unfold there as if they are happening in the present moment. In Léger's corresponding image, paradoxically, magnification has accentuated ambiguity, something he later harnessed in his own experiments with cinema. The temporality of the image is complex. It takes some time for us to get our eye in, so to speak. And once we do that, we notice that there's a soldier who appears to be lying dead or wounded across the center to the left. Both he and the figure in the top right are wearing medals, which could be the French Croix de Guerre or the German Iron Cross. Léger has compressed time levels, conflating the moment of warfare and its aftermath. He also blurs animate and inanimate. His machines all but eclipse the soldiers, echoing Cendrars' allusion to the anonymous machinery of war. Indeterminate metallic fragments with striations might be human hands, but it's hard to tell. They seem to retain that ambiguity. Together, the text and image anticipate Paul Virilio's observation that the First World War marked the transition from proximate hand-to-hand combat to remote warfare waged on a cinematically fragmented landscape viewed through a camera lens. When Cendrars' war ended, cinema offered a possible lifeline. In 1917, he began working as an assistant to director Abel Gance on his film J'accuse. That's Cendrars on the far left with the cigarette that seems to accompany him in every photograph, virtually. That's also Cendrars acting as an extra in J'accuse. He's in the middle on the right-hand side, caught in the light. He worked again on, that's him again, on the front row on the left. It's a really haunting, I mean, in more sense than one, a haunting scene in J'accuse, where the war dead rise up from the battlefield and return to the village to remind those who didn't go to fight of the debt that they owed the victims of that war. It's a really powerful scene. And of course, Cendrars, with his actual missing right arm, was a pretty good candidate to play a mutiné de guerre. Yes, so he worked again on Gance's next film, La Roue. Indeed, Cendrars suggested the film's definitive title and devised some of the fast montage sequences of speeding train wheels. Collage, montage, and the device of the cut all reappear in the volume of poems Kodak, published in 1924, subsequently renamed Documentaire, documentaries, after the Kodak Eastman Company threatened legal action. The poem's brevity, immediacy, and their emphasis on observing through a lens all justify the photographic and cinematic analogies implicit in the title. Some 20 years later, Cendrars revealed that virtually all the poems in this collection were cut-ups, taken directly from Gustave Le Rouge's popular serial, Le Mystérieux Docteur Cornelius. Fittingly enough, the eponymous villain of that serial is a surgeon who moonlights as the leader of a murderous criminal gang called La Main Rouge, the Red Hand. He surgically removes his victim's skin and uses it to create simulacra. Cendrars' poems can also be thought of as grafts, but they bear very scant resemblance to their donor text. On the left, Cendrars, on the right, the source text. You can see what's going on here. The process of reduction is really extreme, to the extent that the very nature of the texts fundamentally changed. Allegedly, Le Rouge, who was a personal friend of Cendrars, didn't actually realize when he read the poems that they'd been taken so wholeheartedly from his book. So these cut-ups foreshadow the post-war experiments of William Burroughs and others. They also anticipate the analogy that Walter Benjamin makes between photography and surgery, and his notion of the camera as a prosthesis that extends human perception. In his later career, Cendrars diversified his artistic collaborations in different ways. Like Léger, who admired the advertising billboards that adorned the streets and squares of Paris, Cendrars hailed advertising as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. In 1935, he wrote the text for Le spectacle est dans la rue, a volume of advertising images by France's foremost poster artist, A.M. Cassandre. And that's a particular favourite of mine. And of course, Cendrars, he sailed on the maiden voyage of the Normandie in 1935, I think. After the Second World War, Cendrars helped to launch the career of an aspiring young photographer called Robert Doisneau with this collaborative book, La banlieue de Paris. The cover of the first edition on the left and the later reprint reflect the contrasting ways in which history has treated them. Doisneau's name is all but invisible in the original edition, but both have equal billing in the reprint. So at this point, I'd like to look more closely at 2 of Cendrars' books that play a pivotal role in his understanding of the book as a visual as well as a literary entity. The first isn't actually a collaboration, but it reflects Cendrars' innovative visual thinking. Published in 1918, Le Panama ou les aventures de mes 7 oncles, Panama or the adventures of my 7 uncles, was written before the First World War, originally with the title Cause du Canal de Panama et de mes 7 oncles. So there, at some stage he envisaged it as being to some extent a companion piece to the prose du Transsibérien. Its radically original design, about which I'll say a bit more in a moment, suggests that Cendrars was acutely attuned to the role that a book's form can play in magnifying the text's capacity to signify. He designed the draft cover himself and enlisted Raoul Dufy to produce the final version. The format, typography, and colour scheme were very directly copied from this North American Railroad timetable. Particularly striking is this binary design with the same motif repeated, so that when we fold it down the middle, it becomes its front and back covers. Interspersing the lines of verse at regular intervals are 25 extracts from genuine route maps of the North American Railroad. These show 3 variants of railway lines connecting San Francisco and the Pacific coast to Chicago and St. Louis, and one from Chicago north to Wisconsin. These divide the poem into interrelated sections corresponding to the stories it recounts about the narrator's 7 uncles. Curiously, the maps and the poem itself relate only very tangentially to the actual isthmus of Panama. An isthmus, I hate saying that word, it's so difficult to say aloud. An isthmus is a thin strip of land that connects 2 larger land masses and separates 2 bodies of water. So that geographic specificity is largely absent from the text of this poem. However, the financial crash of 1892 that caused the collapse of the Panama Canal's building project acts as the starting point for a series of digressions, each of which is centred around a different one of the narrator's 7 uncles. The poem moves effortlessly across locations, time zones, and continents. It also shifts without warning between present and past tenses, which stand in an inconsistent relationship with linear time. It mixes third and first person narrative voices, it blurs the distinction between them, and even the first person voice is multiplied, since it conveys not only the narrator who is taking us through this narrative, but also those of his uncles that are mediated through their letters, which appear without speech marks. So that diversity of voices, they're all sort of levelled out in a way when we read the text, or at least their differences are not immediately apparent. The poem celebrates the activity of reading as diverse and non-hierarchical. Stock exchange bulletins, 16th century religious texts, the letters sent by the narrator's uncles, even postage stamps with lines of verse by Rimbaud, these are all seen as equally exciting and equally valid. Of the narrator's fifth uncle, who is a peripatetic chef, the narrator writes, "Tes menus sont la poésie nouvelle, your menus are the new poetry." The text evokes, without showing, images that are no less eclectic. The animal picture book that enlivened the narrator's childhood, or the Le Petit Journal Illustré, or photographs of the 400 locomotives that were abandoned when the French canal builders left Panama. The poem adopts the Cubist aesthetic of collage and what Rosalind Krauss terms the circulation of the sign. Cendrars presents, sorry, I missed a few slides earlier. I'll not delay though. The poem, Cendrars presents proper nouns. So down at the bottom there, Maggie, Beer, Daily Chronicle, in their raw form, as unfiltered fragments of reality, neither analysed nor explained, and just leaves it to the reader to figure out how they might relate to the surrounding lines. These single word lines evoke a shorthand impression of kiosks and billboards glanced at speed, evincing a perceptual awareness that's constantly in motion. The signifying intent of the book's material form is especially evident in its various binaries and its network of connecting and dividing lines. As we've seen, a fold splits every page vertically down the middle. If the reader carries out the author's intended action and folds the book along that spine, then it too becomes an isthmus of sorts. Even the key element of the poem's title, Le Panama, is split. And it seems to me that the entire book, its secondary level of meaning is all about these dividing lines that cross one another and somehow come to stand for this isthmus of Panama. Now, I'm just going to check how we're doing for time. Have I still got it?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, I'm getting close. Geography then informs and disrupts the reading process. Just over 2/3 of the way through the poem, we come to this page with, on the left, a full page advertisement for Denver. Like the railroad maps, but even more forcefully, this device connotes the real world, but its inclusion is puzzling and compels us to question its textual status. Is this an integral part of the poem? Or is it there, like the Cubists' newspaper cuttings, to create what Barthes terms a reality effect by calling to mind the adverts that we might encounter in an actual railway timetable? The poem cites many place names, but not Denver. Denver does, however, appear on the railroad map, approximately midway between its endpoints, San Francisco and Chicago, which do feature in the poem. And this position at the halfway mark points to a possible connection with the poem's themes that the very last words of the advert reinforce. Denver, Colorado, Berlin, Germany, and Manchester, England are cited by economists as examples of inland cities which have become great because they are located at a sort of natural crossroads. Are we then being invited to interpret Denver as another isthmus, like Panama and its canal, which are both crossing points? A reading of that nature certainly gains credence when we consider that this advert occurs immediately after a line that transports us suddenly and briefly, quite unexpectedly, to Paris. As you can see at the top there, Paris adieu, Paris goodbye. And then that cluster of lines, and then I'll read just the last line there. You go under the Eiffel Tower, looping the loop to come down on the other side of the world. The placing of the Denver advertisement after this line seems significant. This is virtually the only explicit mention of Paris in a poem that covers huge expanses but mostly remains rooted in the continent of America, with occasional excursions to Asia and Africa. The reference to the shipbuilding town of Saint-Nazaire reinforces the theme of travelling between ports, countries, and between old Europe and the New World, as did the narrator's uncles and the poet himself. The map that precedes this section depicts a north-south route from Chicago upwards to Lake Michigan to Wisconsin. On that page, it's had its axis shifted 90 degrees, so what should appear in a north-south axis actually appears horizontally. So I think the intention of that is to further underline the reader's sense of disorientation. What makes Le Panama so remarkable is that without abandoning conventional verse, it becomes a sophisticated kind of spatialized poetry. Cendrars' harnessing of its material format and its typographic and paratextual devices underscores this poem and the reading process too as mobile and multidimensional. And just one more thing before I leave this behind. Le Panama is marked by time in a very interesting way. The 4-year gap that separates the writing of it and its publication is the most profoundly significant period in Cendrars' life. He annotated the proofs with his right hand and then again with his left hand after he lost his right arm. So this poem then is the tangible proof of his own painful negotiation of the passage from pre-war optimism to the sobriety of the interwar years, and from a young avant-garde poet to a mutilé de guerre, a war-wounded and a left-handed writer. So just before I finish off, I'd like to briefly dip into another work, which is La fin du monde, filmé par l'ange ND, the end of the world, filmed by the angel, or well, ND stands for Notre Dame, which is one of 5 significant texts that Cendrars began in September 1917, when the encounter with cinema helped him recover from his terrible war wound. As he later put it, from 1917, I threw myself headlong into cinema. In the essay L'ABC du cinéma, the ABCs of cinema, he strives to characterize the dizzying power of this new visual language that seemed capable of usurping literature, prosthetically augmented by the movie camera, aided by a Bergsonian intuition. Our perceptive faculties transcend intellectual activity and come into contact with life in its purest state. And this short extract from that, I think, brings that out. No longer any need to demonstrate, we're in communion. La fin du monde, filmé par l'ange ND, was created in close collaboration with Fernand Léger. Labelled a roman or novel, it's a stunning artist's book, but it also merits the label ciné-roman, cine-novel, since it embraces so many of the structures and tropes of cinema. As with the Panama poem, Cendrars designed the title page, and it was Léger who completed it for him. So the abbreviation of Notre Dame to the initials ND alerts us to the narrative's terse telegraphic style. Written almost entirely in the present tense, is divided into 55 numbered short scenes, some a mere sentence in length. Like J'ai tué, this story conveys a vision of war, but this one is set in the future and on an interplanetary scale. The main character is God, cast as a Hollywood-style director, complete with fat cigar and green sunshield. The angel of Notre Dame is his cameraman. God has made a huge profit from nearly a century of war. He starts another war with Mars and is forced into hiding. In an attempt to make this war pay, he sends a telegram to some rascals from the Old Testament, requesting them to carry out the prophecies. The angel of Notre Dame blows his horn and the earth goes into meltdown. So too literally does the roll of film that's figuratively showing us all this action. the projector catches fire, and we witness the entire film rewinding, sequence by sequence, to the starting point. We return to the opening scene with God as film director at his desk, but this time he's bankrupt. Léger's designs, with their stenciled letters and fragmented cubist-style painting, have much in common with his contemporaneous paintings. The text and images work closely together. Yeah, that's not the best example I could have shown you, I suppose, but yeah. The text and images work closely together, encroaching on each other's space, becoming an iconotext in which it's hard to disentangle textual and visual modes of signifying. On the opening double page here, Cendrars' text begins not on the right-hand page, but down at the bottom of the left page there. C'est le 31 décembre. It's the 31st of December. It incorporates Léger's illustration, which spills over and comes close to covering over bits of the text. The stenciled lettering and geometric forms connote a modern multilingual urban environment of industry and commerce. With some effort, we decipher fragments such as God at his desk on the top left there, wearing a sunshade and smoking a fat cigar. Familiarity with Léger's pre-war painting, Les Fumeurs, the Smokers, helps us to interpret the plume of smoke emanating from the cigar, just where the word English is cutting across the page there in that bold diagonal. Seen as a whole, this double page invites us to alternate repeatedly between reading and viewing. Léger imports strings of Cendrars' text into his design, such as the fragment down on the lower left at the angle there, which is taken from the Cendrars' text. Il se lève, allume un gros cigare. He gets up, lights a fat cigar. Like the pose du Transsibérien, the reading process here is not so much simultaneous as a constant shuttling between the written and the drawn signs. The fragmented, truncated forms of Léger's illustrations reflect the same principle of montage that defines Cendrars' text, and both foreground optical devices such as the round lens of the camera as a prosthetic extension of human vision. The chapter in which the angel brings about the end of the world is called L'ange en des opérateurs. In the 20th century, the term opérateur came to denote not only a camera operator or cameraman, but also a telegraph operator and typesetter. So in this sense, the angel as opérateur seems to be the perfect symbol for this intermediate work that conflates literature, experimental typography, fine art, and cinema. But the word opérateur also retained more archaic meanings, including someone who conducts surgical operations. Another analogy that anticipates Walter Benjamin's observations on the camera's capacity to penetrate the body like a surgeon's knife. This cooperation between writer and artist represents another high point of Cendrars' visual collaborations. Léger regarded this as one of his most significant early works, and later recalled, Cendrars and I shared a taste for modern things, for life around us. And all these typographical elements, these contrasts with large stenciled letters, well, we thought it up together. It was with this book that I was most closely connected to the writer. Visuality then informs Cendrars' writings from an early stage. His poetic style was naturally attuned to visual perception, and his collaborations with artists highlight this to dazzling effect. Even without his artists though, Cendrars thinks spatially. The Panama poem operates on many levels, and its network of visual signs expands the signifying capacity of the text. For a time, cinema offered a stimulating alternative expressive form, but thankfully it never replaced writing in Cendrars' repertoire. Around the time that La Fin du Monde was published, Cendrars had a brief and unsuccessful foray into film directing, the results of which are now lost. In 1923, he and Léger collaborated again, this time on a ballet for the Ballet Suédois company. In this work, the trope of the end of the world gives way to its opposite, the creation, la création du monde. Once again, then, the phoenix rises from the ashes, shakes itself down, and reinvents itself. Thank you.